Welcome to another Stiglr for the Details. My name is Alan Dickerson, known to some online as Stiglr. And today I thought I would share some great news that I got yesterday. I got an email from someone who I had been collaborating with on creating Vassal modules for the Central Front series of games. And I was delighted to find out that this individual, whose name is Alan Yan, had put the finishing touches on finally, a Vassal module that not only put the entire 5-game series into one module, but also did it with the same counter design as was in the original 5th core release. I'll get more into that later. And also incorporated all of the order of battle changes and consolidation special rules that have since come out in Moves magazine. So basically, what that means is that now you can play the 5-map Central Front series campaign game, now called Red Thrust, that was envisioned when the series was started back in 1979. So that was just huge news. And I thought I'd also kind of go through a brief history of the checkered past of the Central Front series and how it went from a really great idea to something that was almost fatally compromised, but was kept alive through the efforts of some stalwarts over at Consim World, who kind of kept the fires burning for years while a lot of the development was gone. So anyway, let me explain kind of what Central Front series was and is, and some of the events that made for a very tortuous history for it. Originally, the Central Front series began in 1979 with the release of S&T number 82, and it was a Jim Dunnigan and John Butterfield design, and it was supposed to be a operational level modern hypothetical series on a Cold War gone hot in then West Germany. What would happen if the Soviets decided they wanted to just surge out of East Germany and Czechoslovakia and those countries and just basically take over the whole of Germany? And it was envisioned that 5th Corps, which is actually the central map of the 5, going from basically northerly to southerly, it was envisioned that 5th Corps would eventually be a 10-map, huge game. And here's 5th Corps here in the center here. So this was the first release. And then it was envisioned that additional games would be released to fill out the first 5 maps at least. And those would have the original order of battle for the Soviet invasion. And I suppose the 5th might simply only use the counter set whatever was left, or perhaps there would be other reinforcements that would come in, maybe from England, America, and France and other countries after the initial, say, week of the war was fought in the original 5 maps. So 5th Corps was the first release. And then about a year later, British Army of the Rhine, or Bayor, appeared in S&T number 88, and that one was designed by Charles Camps with an assist from John Butterfield. And in the meantime, between that intervening year, the second installment, or Hofgap, was released as a standalone boxed game. So this was not an S&T issue game. It was a box game, which also had a fairly limited print run. And so, of course, that complicated ownership of anything like the complete set, because Hofgap quickly became very, very hard to find in a box. And of course, the number printed was nothing like the circulation and print run for an S&T magazine. So that kind of set off a interesting dynamic in the market, a scarcity for a much needed portion of the map. Then, after the first three games were released, that being Fifth Corps, Hofgap, and British Army of the Rhine, something horrible happened, and basically SPI went out of business. They had long financial problems, and the opportunists of TSR, of Dungeons and Dragons fame, kind of pulled a little bit of a fast one. They offered them some financing to help them make payroll and survive a little bit longer. And then once they got SPI to, take the funds, they called in the note and basically forced them to sign over the company to TSR. TSR had the company for a while, and then they sold to 3W, and then 3W eventually would sell out to Decision Games. And during that whole sad process, S&T magazine also went over to both 3W and to Decision Games in turn. And during that period, two more games were released for the Central Front system, namely North German Plain here in S&T number 117, and also Donau Front in number 131. Now, in addition to North German Plain and Donau Front here being created by 3W or TSR, not exactly sure which, they retained the services of Charles Camp to continue the design, but they dumbed it down and they essentially changed the entire combat system. So all the counters were different, had different symbology on it, but strangely enough, they kept the rather unique style of maps, which we'll show you soon. And so it immediately broke up any chance of there really being a completed system. Then finally, the system just kind of languished, because you had 5 maps and 2 systems, and they didn't match up, and it was just a mess. So in the annals of Consim World, the community and forums on that site, Central Front took up residence in a forum there, or a folder there, and people began to swap notes and started to work on a plan to bring Donau Front and North German Plain into the fold of the original Central Front system. And they came up with first a consolidated rule set that brought the rules for the central 3 maps together so that you could play those as one campaign game called Mittelland Thrust. And also they began working, or actually I should say who they are. A lot of the work was done by Richard Lloyd and Dick Wohlers, and also a new counter sheet project was begun by a fellow named Kerry Anderson, who started the task of making original Central Front counters for the Donau Front and the North German Plain maps to bring them in line with the original system and to incorporate some changes to the order of battle that resulted from just basically time and having more access to declassified information about both Warsaw Pact and NATO forces. So all of that started happening on Comston World, and also people who were creating Vassal modules started creating first standalone Vassal modules for the original 3 games, Fifth Corps, Hofgap, and Bayor. And then there were attempts to put all 3 into one Vassal module. And then there were attempts to start to use the Kerry Anderson counters in a consolidated Vassal module for 3 maps, and then for 5 maps. And as you can imagine, the efforts were not completely coordinated. And the thing that was really missing, and what I really wanted to see, was all 5 maps using the original counter set, or what would have been the original counter set for Donau Front and North German Plain. So during this whole period, I was involved in some of the creation of Vassal modules for the standalone games. And if, Alan Yan contacted me and said he was kind of working on a project to actually create the original Series 5 mapper in a Vassal module that I had always envisioned. And I thought that was great, and hadn't heard from him in maybe a couple of years. And I had kind of given up on the idea that maybe the series could be done in the original format, and thought, well, maybe if I get a set of the Kerry Anderson counters, which were changed a little bit, then maybe I could digitize those and put those all into a Vassal module. So I would have all of the maps, but the Kerry Anderson newer counters, but the new order of battle. Okay, maybe I could go with that, with some modifications. But this, what Alan Yan has turned out, is what I have wanted all along. And let me show it to you here. This is so you can see here, it's 5 maps wide. This is turned on its side 90 degrees. So basically to the right is northerly, and this is the North German Plain map, followed by the British Army of the Rhine map. And then moving a little further west for the Fifth Corps map. There's Frankfurt there in the center, and the Rhine River. And then moving south, we get to the Hofgap map here. Here's Nuremberg. And now world famous Fulda is in here somewhere in the gap there. I believe this is it. And then moving down here, the Donau front map, which has Bavaria in it. And here's Munich or München. And all of these are now on one map. I've been doing a little bit of color correcting work to it. I'm not quite finished with it yet, but this is it. And it really, really looks great. And the other thing about putting all of this in a Vassal module is that it incorporates some developments that were put into some of the intervening modules. And some of them were that we came up with the idea, that being Massimiliano Colombi, and he did the coding and all the under the hood Vassal work. I came up with the idea for these corner banners that show the friction point levels for various units. If you're at all familiar with this groundbreaking system, it doesn't use, say, straight out elimination or step losses, reductions in strength by flipping the counters, those sort of things. It doesn't use that at all. Rather, it hypothesizes that the nature of modern combat is that units stay potent at all times, but they acquire the concept of friction through actual losses, fatigue, running out of ammo, running out of fuel. Those sort of things tend to make the unit more brittle. And once it reaches a certain point, basically the unit just falls apart and ceases to exist. And so that has been simulated here through the use of friction points. So as you undertake operations, and that by operations I mean anything from moving from place to place to conducting combat, all of those things increase your friction point level. So just initiating combat or defending combat will give you a friction point. And then the result of that combat from the combat results table may give one or both sides more friction points, and so on and so on. So the Soviet player who has a timeline and needs to make a swift invasion, kind of a Schwerpunkt kind of attack, and drive deep behind the NATO lines and capture bridges across the Rhine, control of certain cities. All of those things are very important for the Soviets to do quickly. But as he moves and fights, he may or may not acquire more or less friction points on the way there. The combat results table is very, very subtle and has a lot of nuance in the way that the Soviets can use their very, very powerful units. As you can see here, you got a guards tank unit here with 11 factors on attack, 12 on defense. And they're up against these little armored cavalry regiments with strengths of 1. So it seems like a really, really uneven combat. And in a sense, you're right. But NATO has some things going for it, namely the terrain, and the ability to offset friction points from combat by withdrawing and retreating, and on a one-for-one basis. So if you get a combat result that says you take 4 friction points, that's enough to kill the unit outright. But it can retreat along roads up to 4 of those friction points. I believe it has to take 1 of them for the result, but the other three, it can just simply retreat 3 hexes along a road, and then the Soviets have to follow it to offset that. So then, of course, buried within the combat results table, there are some results where the attacker will also take a friction point loss. But if the defender decides to offset any of his friction points with retreats, that reduces the attacker's friction point cost, usually reducing it to 0. So there's a very, very interesting cat and mouse game of how far the Soviets can push the beleaguered NATO troops without burning themselves out in terms of acquired friction points and just bad luck results. Yeah, it's a wonderful system. But anyway, we came up with this banner thing to put on the Vassal counters the equivalent of another counter that would go underneath. That would simply be a black counter with a white number indicating how many friction points the unit had acquired. So as you can imagine, this basically doubled the stacks of counters. And also, we added a method of automating the friction point recovery segment. So at the beginning of each turn, you determine which units are in supply, and then you flip over the counters from the side with the white letters, which means this unit has actually one more friction point than is stated here. These are units which have not moved at all during the turn, so they are in their non-friction point side. So basically, during a turn, a unit can, if provided that it moves in the first operation segment, does something, either attacks, moves, or even simply decides it takes on friction. Even if it doesn't move, it still takes on a friction point so that it reserves its right to move later in the turn. So the first segment, when units move and fight and use operations points, they acquire a friction point and they flip over to their white side. Then, and also in that first operations phase, they have the maximum number of capabilities. So they have 12 operations points that they can expend in movement or combat or both. And then in subsequent phases, there is a additional cost added to every hex that you enter is an additional friction point, or an additional operations point for every hex you enter, or a half if you're along an autobahn. There is a additional operations point cost for every type of attack that you undertake. So basically, you're slowed down to almost half of what the original operations points are at the start of the turn. And for every subsequent operations phase that you undertake operations, you gain another friction point just for continuing to move. So the way the game moves is the Soviets use their initial operations phase, NATO uses their initial operations phase, and then each side has its second, third, fourth, as many as the players desire until both sides pass, and that ends the turn. So the Soviet player basically can determine, how hard he wants to push his forces, how many operations phases he wants to undertake, And then at the start of the next turn, all in supply combat units get 1 friction point back. The artillery units get 2 back because some of their friction points are assumed to simply be munitions. So the system is very, very interesting and tense, and it's just a ball to play. And it's always been a dream of mine to undertake a full 5-map game. And so now this puts that tantalizingly within reach. So I'm kind of beating the drum and trying to see if there is maybe any interest out there somewhere to draw up, say, teams of up to, say, 10 players, where you would have 1 NATO and 1 Warsaw Pact player for each map. So a 5-on-5, or maybe you could make it a 3-on-3 and kind of divvy up responsibilities from north to south in some other fashion. But there's just a lot here, and finally seeing all of this on the map with the original counter designs, all of that, it's really, really got me feeling optimistic about this. So anyway, I wanted to film a episode of this to kind of make the announcement and get the word out and just see where it goes. So if you have any comments or questions about Central Front, maybe including one I can kind of cut off at the pass, which is, where is this available? You can find this on the vassalengine.org site. And then, of course, you would go to the modules tab, look up Central Front series, and there you will find not only this module, but some of the others that came before it in various flavors of development. If you have any other questions or comments about this, put them in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you like the content that you get from my channel, and we will see you next time.